Welcome to this fourth and final video in the series detailing how to create a workflow in Visio, how to then configure this workflow in SharePoint Designer, and finally in this video we're going to see our workflow in action. At the end of the previous video I published my workflow to my SharePoint 2010 site. I've now opened my SharePoint 2010 site and I'm going to now open the expenses list that we created in the very first walkthrough. I do this by clicking on its name. Once the list has opened, I'm going to add a new item to the list so we can see the workflow in action. I do this by clicking Add New Item. I then give my expense a title, Train, the date of when I claimed it, and finally I put in the expense value. As you remember from our workflow, if our expense was under £100, the workflow was to be sent directly for approval. So for this first example, I'm going to put my expense in as a value under £100. Let's put this in, £67.50. Then press Save. My new expense item has been added to the list. In the expense workflow column on our list, you can see I have a link to In Progress. If I click on this, I can track the progress of my workflow. This page gives me the details of my workflow. I can find the person that initiated the workflow. That's myself, the administrator. The time it started. I can also have a link back to the item the workflow was created on and the status of my workflow. I can see it's in progress. The task section displays any tasks related to this workflow. I can see that a task has been assigned to Web Server Administrator and the title being Please Approve Expense. I've got a due date and the status, which is not started. The final section of the page is the workflow history. I have two errors on the page, however this relates to the fact that I don't have an email address set up for my administrator account. This has nothing to do with the workflow not working properly. As you remember, we validated it in SharePoint Designer so we know it's going to work. If I go back to the tasks section, I can click on the title of the task to open it. The approval workflow task has now opened in front of me. I have a link at the top of the page that takes me to the original item that this workflow was generated from. My status is not started. I have my due date, who it was requested by, the requested by being the original submitter. I'm logged in as administrator, so it was me that started this workflow. And I have some comments. The start of the approval, who it was started by and the time. In the final section I can add my comments to explain why I am approving this expense item. I'll add some detail. Justified expense. I can then choose to approve, reject, cancel this workflow or reassign this workflow task to somebody else. However, in this example I'm going to approve this workflow task, so I click the Approve button. We're brought back to the workflow information page. We can see if I look at the tasks section, the task status is complete, the outcome is approved. When I look at my workflow history, I have an entry for where the approval task was created. I have an error where the email couldn't send. Then I have two final completed entries to tell me that the approval task was completed and that finally the workflow was completed because approval is the end of my workflow. If I now go back to my expenses list, we see the train item that I was seeking approval for, the expense workflow column has now been set to approved. I'm now going to add a second entry to my list, and this entry I'm going to set the value as over £100. You remember in our workflow we had two outcomes depending on the value of the expense value. If it's over £100, I'm asked to fill in some additional information. So, to add my new item, I click Add New Item. I then add some details to the screen that appears. So I'll call this dinner. I'll add my date of when I claimed it. And then for my expense value, I'm going to put in £250. When I'm finished, I press the Save button. We can see the new item has been added, the dinner item, and we can see in the expense workflow column the expense is in progress. I'm going to click on that link so we can go to the workflow information page. In the workflow information page we can see the status is in progress. If we look at the tasks section, we can see there is a task generated for further information required re expense item. You remember in our workflow we created a workflow step that would request additional information from the expense submitter if their expense value is over £100. I'm going to click on the title of the task to open it. I have two fields. I have comments and client field. These are the ones we created in the second workflow video. I'll add in my comments, taking clients for lunch. Then my clients field, you remember we set this as a choice field type, so I've got a drop down, and I'll say I was taking Microsoft out for lunch. I then click complete task as I've filled in all my additional information. When we go back to the workflow information page, we can see that the further information required task is now set at completed, the outcome is completed, and a new task has been generated seeking approval for this expense item. If I click on the expense approval, you can see in my comments section I've been asked to approve and see additional information. The additional information being the information I just filled in the first screen, and then I can add some comments. So let's put fine. And I'm going to approve this workflow now because I've got my additional information and that's fine. So I approve. The page is refreshed again. The status for this workflow is now approved. If we look at the task, the expense approval task, the status is completed, the outcome is approved. If I scroll down to the workflow history, we can see our final item on this list. Approval was completed, approval on diner has successfully completed, all participants have completed their tasks. This means the workflow has been completed. If I go back to my expense list, we can see the dinner item on my expense list has now been approved as well. Thank you for watching these 4 videos in this series. If you have any further questions about anything covered in these videos, please do not hesitate to get in touch with Solutions Developed and we will be more than happy to help you with your query. Thank you.